Italy belongs to us. France belongs to us. To us belong Spain, Germany, Hungary, Dalmatia, Illyricum, and many other nations. The Roman Empire is found wherever the Roman language holds sway. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King, and that was the brilliant scholar Lorenzo Valla writing in 1441. Valla was talking about the Latin language and about how the Roman Empire was, among other things, an empire of language, a language that, like the Roman legions, conquered vast territories of the globe. In fact, you could argue that the greatest legacy and most impressive feat of the ancient Romans wasn't their monumental buildings and giant aqueducts, or their virtually invincible armies, or their brilliant engineers, or their admirable system of roads, or their public health, or their laws, or even their underfloor heating, but rather it was the Latin language, one of the greatest inventions of the human mind. Many people in Valla's time in Italy in the 1400s would have agreed. However, some of them also believed that, sadly, the Latin language had drastically deteriorated over the previous 1,000 years. As one scholar in the 1400s claimed, the Latin of the previous centuries was paltry, unpolished, uncouth, and barbarous. These scholars believed that culture, politics, and society as a whole could not thrive, as the ancient Romans had thrived, unless and until Latin was restored to its former glory. Latin was the foundation of every branch of knowledge, and so a feeble grasp of Latin was an impediment to learning, and therefore an impediment to cultural and political achievement. Reviving and restoring good classical Latin was therefore one of the major projects, if not the major project, of the Italian intellectuals in the 1400s, of the men, in other words, who invented what we call the Italian Renaissance. First of all, a bit of history. That is, how Latin originated, developed, and survived for some 2,000 years before it reached Lorenzo Valla and his friends in what they regarded as its deplorably degraded state. Latin was born on the banks of the Tiber. The name Latin comes from a tribe called the Latini, who around 900 BC, say some 200 years before Romulus and Remus founded Rome in 753 BC, settled in the lands on the Italian peninsula just south of the Tiber. They spoke what is called an Italic language, one of the many Indo-European languages that came to Italy as part of a great centuries-long diaspora from Central and Eastern Europe in the centuries around 1000 BC. Neighboring tribes at this time spoke related languages, Oscan to the south, Umbrian to the north, but there were also, as an interesting addition to this linguistic mixture, the Etruscans, a pre-existing civilization who spoke an entirely different language, i.e. one that was not Indo-European, but one that over the centuries certainly influenced the language and also the culture of the Latini. Around 500 BC, the time of the founding of the Roman Republic, the Latini, or the Romans, as we can begin calling them, following the founding of Rome in the middle of the 8th century BC, around 500 BC, that is, the Romans still only occupied a small area on the west coast of central Italy. But over the following centuries, they would aggressively expand throughout the peninsula, dominating and conquering the other peoples, including the Etruscans, whom they finally defeated in the 3rd century BC, by which time the Romans were in control of virtually the entire peninsula, from which these other languages were gradually being expunged. Efforts were made during the Roman Republic and then in the first decades of the empire to turn Latin into a supple and elegant language. This is what is now called classical Latin, the polished and refined literary language and elite Latin that was no doubt based on a kind of upper class usage. Its golden age spanned the 1st century BC, let's say from around the time of the birth of Julius Caesar, into the first decades of the 1st century AD under the reign of Augustus. This classical Latin was divided between a prose style, best exemplified by Julius Caesar and Cicero, and a poetic one, especially that of Virgil and Horace. But in both of these registers, there was a well-ordered and coherent system that was detached from, its users might have said, untainted by more everyday oral forms that you would have found in the streets and markets and homes, i.e., untainted by the vernacular or vulgar Latin, the Latin of the people, which I talk about in my other video, my companion piece on the vernacular. Now, if you thought Julius Caesar was just a great warrior and general, he was also a brilliant writer and speaker in classical Latin. In fact, he was one of its greatest practitioners. And while crossing the Alps with his army, he took time to write a book on correct Latin grammar, now mostly lost, unfortunately. This was a work called De Analogia, and a Roman grammarian later claimed he was discussing the declension of nouns amid flying arrows and the classification of words to the blaring of bugles and trumpets. Caesar dedicated the work to Cicero, who repaid the compliment because in one of his works, he says that Caesar is the purest user of the Latin tongue. And 2 millennia later, that judgment still holds, since an Italian critic has recently written of Caesar's histories, his works on the Gallic War and the Civil War, that he combines limpid clarity with a strength and crystalline simplicity sensitive to the most precise nuances of thought. That really exemplifies the style of classical Latin, subtle thought expressed with clarity and simplicity, and sometimes, as in the case of Cicero's flourishes, with unparalleled craftsmanship. The beauty of classical Latin became a source of pride among elite Romans. Cicero describes how the eloquence of the Latin language contributed more to the prestige of the Romans than the Roman armies storming fortresses. Measures were therefore taken to protect it from the impurities that inevitably came from immigration and conquest. Cicero writes about how there was, in his time, an influx of many impure speakers coming from different places, i.e., from different cities in Italy, as well as different regions around Europe and Africa. And so during the late Republic, the middle of the 1st century BC, books on correct grammar and spelling began appearing, such as the one that was written by Julius Caesar. Following the deaths of Caesar and Cicero, the Emperor Augustus promoted beautiful Latin for his own prestige, and he took things such as grammar and spelling extremely seriously. The historian Suetonius tells us that Augustus once sacked a government official for writing ixi instead of ipsi, that is, for spelling phonetically and spelling wrongly, according to Augustus. Such an error made Suetonius consider the official an uncultivated and ignorant fellow. So there was a divide between how many people spoke Latin and how the best practitioners wrote it, a divide that after Augustus is going to get wider and wider. A century after Augustus, say by 100 AD, Latin had more or less wiped out all the other dialects on the Italian peninsula, with the exception of Greek in the far south. Some of these languages appear to have had an interesting afterlife, something I talk about in my video on the vernacular. Latin had also, of course, spread far beyond the Italian peninsula, ultimately from the shores of the Caspian Sea to North Africa, Portugal, and England. Here we see a map of the Roman Empire in 117 AD at the end of Trajan's reign, showing the boundaries of the empire during its greatest extent, although note that Greek was still the dominant language in the eastern parts of the empire. Roman soldiers, magistrates, governors, and colonists, all of them spread Latin through all the provinces of the empire, so that by, say, 120 AD, millions, maybe even tens of millions of people may have spoken or at least understood Latin or a version of it. And I say a version of it because what was spreading was not necessarily still the language of Caesar, Cicero, and Augustus, i.e., the language of Latin's golden age, Rather, the written and spoken forms were both evolving and, perhaps inevitably, parting company. Occasionally, attempts were made at some kind of correction or standardization. Around the 3rd or 4th century AD, the so-called Appendix Probi appeared, listing common grammatical and spelling mistakes in Latin. It's a list of 227 frequent mistakes and their correction. For example, vetulus, old instead of veclus, columna instead of columna, frigida instead of fricta, auris instead of auricla, and so on. The interesting thing here is that it gives us a snapshot of the way Latin was developing into what would become the Romance languages of Europe, Italian, Spanish, French, etc. Auricla is turning into orecchio, veclus into vecchio. As such, the Appendix Probi was a finger in a dike that was about to burst. There were other pressures on Latin besides its millions of users. Latin continued to evolve, for example, after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 476 AD. It inevitably took a beating as the Gothic tribes, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and then the Lombards, all of whom spoke Germanic languages, took control of areas previously governed by the Romans. The Ostrogothic kingdom would encompass all of Italy, Sicily, and the Balkans, and later, in the middle of the 8th century, the Lombard kingdom covered much of the Italian peninsula, as then did the kingdom of the Franks. The German languages, incidentally, introduced many new words into what is now Italian, words such as guerra and birra. However, Latin was kept alive in these centuries by the Catholic Church. By the 4th century, we have the steady Christianization of the Roman Empire. Jerome, writing in about 400 AD, gives a wonderful image of the change that rapidly overtook so much of the world. From India, he wrote, from Persia, from Ethiopia, we daily welcome crowds of monks. The Armenian bowman has laid aside his quiver. The Huns learn the Psalter. The chilly Scythians are warmed with the glow of the faith. And so if much of the world was becoming Christian, Christianity, in the West at least, in Western Europe, became Latin. Latin was the language of the church, of its liturgy, rituals, and texts, including the Bible, which was translated from Greek into Latin as early as the 2nd century AD, and then famously by St. Jerome, who was commissioned by the Pope to do a translation, what we know as the Vulgate, in 382 AD. And Latin therefore became, like Greek and Hebrew, a sacred language. So the church became the custodian, the guardian of the Latin language, and Latin would survive as a written language because of it, and arguably only because of it. But Latin inevitably changed under this new world order of Christianity. Christianity, on the whole, shied away from the oratorical grandeur of Cicero and company. Christian writers seem to take pride in the fact that they didn't resort to the showy rhetorical excesses of the pagan literary style from the golden age of Latin. For example, St. Jerome, who, as I said, translated the Bible into Latin around 400 AD, once had a dream in which he saw himself rebuked by Christ himself for being a follower of Cicero. Jerome recognized that, for the most part, the Bible was not Ciceronian in its language. He claimed that the Psalms were as good as the poetry of Horace, but he spoke with some regret about what he called simple and occasionally crude expressions found elsewhere in the Bible, crude expressions that he needed to render into Latin, which was inevitably then a cruder Latin than that of Cicero or Caesar. The Latin of the Christian world and its theologians naturally differed from that of the orators and writers of ancient Rome. Christianity changed the meanings of a lot of words, which is, of course, how languages evolve. They're adapted by the users to new circumstances in which the users find themselves. A good example is the Latin word fides. For the Romans, this word had a very specific meaning. It was a kind of character trait, the necessary element of various social and political transactions, something like good faith, reliability, or credibility, sort of meaning that survives in our expression bona fides or bona fides. For the Christians, however, fides was what we call faith, the faith that takes place in the heart of the believer, a transaction between the believer and his or her God. These mutations were not just ecclesiastical, because Latin terms had to be invented for objects discovered or invented during the Middle Ages, as notaries and clerks, for example, molded the language to their needs as they made it describe their reality. A fascinating question is that of the so-called death of Latin, that is, when it ceased to be spoken and understood by the masses, or when the language spoken and understood by the masses ceased to be close enough to Latin to be called Latin. This shift obviously would have varied region by region, but it's usually assumed that Latin remained a living language until at least the end of the 7th century, after which, for the most part, virtually everyone who understood Latin had to learn it as a second language. Intriguingly, however, there are phrase books from after this point, i.e., after the 7th century, that give useful everyday expressions for travelers and pilgrims, things such as, "Can you cut my hair? Can you wash my shirt? And will you sleep with me?" And these phrases, tellingly, were given in Latin, which indicates at least a certain level of Latin in the medieval service, tourist, and hospitality industries. In any case, written Latin had moved progressively away from the clarity and elegance of classical Latin. The language of public documents, chronicles, lives of the saints, liturgical texts, all of these writings and documents became increasingly clunky and inexact, full of vernacular expressions, untidy or unhappy neologisms, uncertain grammar, inconsistent syntax, and so forth. The spelling of words, for example, was inconsistent and changeable. The medieval Latin word for timber, materiamen, a word that did not exist in ancient Rome, has been found spelled in 50 different ways. For the Latin enthusiasts in Florence in the 1400s, this situation, what they regarded as a corruption and decline, had been going on unabated for many centuries as Latin fell farther and farther away from the grandeur that was Rome. We now know that the situation was not nearly as bad as they believed. During the Middle Ages, there were both extremely literate scholars, men such as Peter Abelard or John of Salisbury, and concerted attempts, most notably under Charlemagne around the year 800, to improve Latin learning through the study of ancient Roman authors. This is the time of the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Also, great authors of the classical past, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, had been a big part of the curriculum of medieval schools. It's simply not the case that classical authors were unknown and unstudied in the Middle Ages. For example, we still have today more than 1,000 manuscripts of the poems of Virgil copied during the Middle Ages, and there are at least 1,240 surviving medieval manuscripts containing Cicero's works on rhetoric alone. This is an illustration from one of them, copied in about 1220, probably in northern Italy, showing Cicero in the middle, crowned like a king, flanked by Julius Caesar and Cato the Younger, the Roman politician. So in 1220, Cicero was still king of rhetoric and was still being celebrated and still being read. We shouldn't be too surprised because good Latin, after all, was necessary for many posts, both ecclesiastical and political or administrative. Mastery of Latin gained you access to influential positions, and one of the best ways to learn Latin, medieval teachers believed, was to read the ancient authors. And to defend medieval Latin and its users, words always change meaning in a language, The scholar Marcus Varro, author of a grammar book and Julius Caesar's librarian, noted that in his lifetime, i.e., during the absolute peak of classical Latin, there were many changes in the meanings of words. He notes that novissimus, which originally meant newest or latest, had come to mean final or last. And crucially, Varro doesn't see this as a bad thing. He only says that some older speakers are perplexed by changes wrought by what he calls recentiores urbani, in other words, trendy urban types. There's no use getting hot and bothered about neologisms because Cicero himself invented words. He coined Latin equivalents for many Greek words, adding to the Latin vocabulary. The Latin words for essence, for quality, for moral, all appear for the first time in Cicero's writings. But the Florentines, as well as humanist scholars in other cities, Lorenzo Valla was a Roman, developed the narrative of the sad decline from a golden age of Latin, i.e., in the time of Cicero, of a decline that needed to be arrested and of a golden age that needed to be restored. There was a kind of nationalism or jingoism to their arguments. They believed that the barbarians, the Goths, i.e., the Germans, Lombards, and Franks, had ultimately learned Latin, but they'd made it over in their own barbarous image. There's an obvious parallel here with art and architecture, because the Italian cognoscenti of the 1400s denigrated Gothic architecture born in the barbarian lands north of the Alps. They called it the maniera tedesca, the German manner or style, and they found it ungainly, clumsily functional rather than aesthetically pleasing, and hobbled by piecemeal and random add-ons and design compromises, such as flying buttresses. We see them here at the Cathedral of Chartres in France, which incidentally is an absolutely beautiful building. But there was in Gothic architecture, these scholars believed, no symmetry, proportion, or overall unity, those exact qualities found, of course, in ancient Roman architecture. So Latin, which had been born and nurtured and reached its height on Italian soil thanks to the Romans, had been corrupted by the barbarians. We had a kind of fall of the Roman language to go along with the fall of the Roman Empire. A key figure in this view, as in so many other things, was Petrarch, and I humbly and modestly refer you to my video on Petrarch. In 1368, he argued that the papacy should move back to Rome from Avignon, to which it had decamped in 1309, and he backed himself up by saying, there is no learned person in France. The French were barbarians who did not know how to read or write Latin properly, and as such, France was an inappropriate setting for the papacy. Petrarch taught himself to write an elegant classicizing Latin, very different from that of the Middle Ages. He got rid of medieval Latin words and syntax, in effect purging himself of these barbarian expressions in a return to an earlier cleansed classical idiom, in particular that of Cicero, several of whose works he rediscovered in the 1330s and 1340s. This anti-barbarian theme runs through Italian authors in the following century. Lorenzo Valla was irked by the fact that one of the most widely used Latin grammars in schools in the Middle Ages had been the Doctrinale, written in about the year 1200 by, of all people, a Frenchman, Alexandre of Villedieu. His grammar became, for Italian scholars, a symbol of the bad Latin taught during the Middle Ages. Valla claimed that Alexander's work was barbarous and full of errors. Valla and his friends hoped that writers and orators would pattern themselves on the writers and orators from an age when the Latin language was at the height of its expression. They wanted to recapture classical Latin and to use it as a powerful political and cultural instrument. The key to good Latin, and therefore to making Italy and Rome great again, was better teaching and better textbooks giving better examples. This is where Valla came to the rescue. he viciously slagged off Alexandre of Villedieu and all other medieval writers of Latin grammars, but at least he put his money where his mouth was, and in 1441 he wrote his Elegantiae Linguae Latinae. He based his text on ancient Roman authors from the golden age of Latin and explained grammar using examples exclusively from their texts, thereby trying to wipe out the previous 1,000 or more years of Latin development to rewind the language back to the 1st century BC. The most important grammar book, though, was Niccolo Perotti's Rudimenta Grammatices, the best-selling grammar text of the 15th century. It completely purged itself of words and syntax that came from medieval Latin, concentrating exclusively on classical Latin with only ancient Roman authors making the cut. It also acted as a kind of dictionary because it included discussions of classical words that had fallen out of use for the previous, say, 1,500 years. This is a printed edition of it because we've reached the age of the printing press, and these ideas can now be disseminated much more widely. Ultimately, you could argue that this creation of what is now called Neo-Latin was a conservative project, and you could argue that this dedication to classical Latin, this turning back the linguistic dial 1,500 years, was something that stifled personal style and refused to accept that language should adapt to the needs of its users. Instead, it reveled in and fetishized the language of the past. It almost became a kind of antiquarianism or an archaeology that sought to unearth ancient linguistic artifacts and force them into use in place of the tools that people had been using for centuries before that. As an opponent of this position once joked, whatever was not said by Cicero must be avoided. However, Valla and his friends did do more than just act like stuffy antiquarians or finger-wagging grammar cranks. Their expertise in Latin, as well as in history and philosophy, the tools of analysis given to them by their studies of the ancients, allowed them to sift through documents and give penetrating close readings of texts. Valla, for example, performed what was probably the most significant scholarly feat of the century. He exposed the donation of Constantine as a forgery. The donation of Constantine was an imperial decree supposedly written by Emperor Constantine in 315 AD, granting the Catholic Church ownership over vast territories of the Roman Empire, including lands in Italy. Constantine gave these lands, according to this document, because Pope Sylvester I cured him of leprosy. Here we see a 13th century fresco showing Sylvester on the left receiving the donation from Constantine. Valla pulled this document apart, showing that it was full of amateurish historical errors and boneheaded anachronisms, that these clumsy mistakes meant it couldn't possibly have been written in 315 AD, that it was therefore an obvious fake, and that Constantine had not, in fact, given all that land to the church. But there was also more. The Oxford historian Alexander Murray has argued that the appeal by these scholars for classical Latin wasn't ultimately about ornamentation, affectation, snobbery, or conservatism, but rather that with its cases, inflections, tenses, and moods, classical Latin allowed for a much more precise and sophisticated level of thinking and analysis than the vernacular languages of the time, or than medieval Latin for that matter. In short, good Latin better apprehended and expressed the world's complexities. So we're back to Julius Caesar's limpid clarity and precise nuances of thought. But of course, the irony is that at exactly this time, the vernacular languages were catching up, and they too would seek to capture these complexities and to usurp the role of Latin in literature and public debate. But that, of course, is another story, but one that, fortuitously, I tell in my companion video on the Renaissance discovery of the vernacular. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, watch my other videos, and if you want to know more about Lorenzo Valla, about Niccolo Perotti, about intellectual debate in Renaissance Italy more generally, or if you just want to read a ripping good yarn, you could do much worse than to read my latest book, The Bookseller of Florence, available from your favorite bookshop.